Emma's frozen fingers clutched her torn shawl as she stumbled through the snow, her husband's drunken shouts still echoing behind her. The wind cut through her thin dress like knives, but she pressed forward into the darkness. Behind her, their cabin door slammed again and again as Thomas searched for his missing wife. She had waited until his whiskey-heavy breathing turned to snores before creeping from their bed. The bruises on her ribs screamed with each step, but freedom lay somewhere beyond this frozen prairie. Better to die in the snow than endure another beating, another night of his hands around her throat. Her bare feet had long since lost feeling. Blood marked her trail, but the fallen snow would cover it soon. Thomas might not even notice her gone until morning if she was lucky, if God showed her the mercy that had been absent from her marriage. The world tilted suddenly. Emma's knees hit the frozen ground, her breath coming in white puffs that faded quickly in the bitter air. She couldn't feel her hands anymore. The shawl slipped from her shoulders as she tried to rise, but her legs wouldn't obey. "Get up," she whispered to herself, the words Thomas had snarled 1,000 times. "Get up, or he'll find you." But her body had nothing left to give. The snow felt almost warm now against her cheek as she curled into a ball, pulling her knees to her chest. At least here, in this white silence, there was no shouting, no hitting, no cruel hands demanding what she couldn't give. Hoofbeats thundered somewhere in the distance, but they seemed far away, like sounds from a dream. Emma tried to crawl deeper into the snowdrift to hide, but darkness was pulling her down. The horses stopped nearby. Male voices spoke in a language she didn't recognize, their tones low and urgent. Emma's heart hammered against her ribs. More men. Always more men with their grabbing hands and harsh demands. Boots crunched through snow toward her. She tried to curl smaller, to disappear, but strong hands were already reaching for her. Emma whimpered and tried to pull away, expecting the familiar bite of fingers digging into her arms. Instead, the touch came gentle as a whisper. Someone lifted her carefully, cradling her against warmth and the scent of leather and sage. A deep voice murmured something soothing in words she couldn't understand, but the tone held no anger, no violence. Through her fading consciousness, Emma felt herself being wrapped in heavy fur, soft and warm against her frozen skin. The man holding her moved with steady grace, his arms secure but not confining. No grabbing, no squeezing until she gasped. "Please," she whispered against the stranger's chest, not sure what she was asking for. The voice answered in accented English, each word careful and calm. "You are safe now." Emma wanted to tell him that nowhere was safe, that men always hurt women eventually, that kindness was just a trap. But the darkness claimed her before she could form the words. Chief Akacheta looked down at the broken woman in his arms as his horse carried them toward camp. Her dress was torn, her face marked with fading bruises that told their own story. Even unconscious, she flinched whenever his hold shifted, her body remembering cruelty. Behind him, his warriors spoke quietly among themselves, but Akacheta's attention remained on the fragile life he carried. She was young, perhaps 20 winters, with golden hair that caught moonlight like prairie grass. Her breathing came shallow and quick, even in sleep. When they reached camp, he carried her directly to his grandmother's lodge. Winona took one look at the unconscious woman and began preparing healing herbs without questions. This was women's business now. As Akacheta laid Emma gently on the sleeping furs, she stirred and cried out, her hands rising defensively. Even asleep, she fought invisible attackers. "Shh," he murmured, stepping back quickly. "No harm will come to you here. You have my word." Emma woke to gentle warmth and panicked. No man had ever been gentle. Soft furs surrounded her instead of the rough wool blanket that usually covered her bruised body. The air smelled of sage and wood smoke rather than Thomas's sour whiskey breath. She sat up too quickly, her head spinning as she took in the unfamiliar surroundings. Animal hide walls curved above her, painted with symbols she didn't recognize. This wasn't her cabin. This wasn't anywhere Thomas could reach her. An elderly woman with kind eyes and silver-streaked braids entered, carrying a clay bowl. She spoke softly in the same musical language Emma had heard before losing consciousness. When Emma shrank back against the far wall, the woman simply set the bowl down and retreated, her movement smooth and unthreatening. Steam rose from the bowl, carrying the scent of meat and herbs. Emma's stomach clenched with hunger, but she remained pressed against the lodge wall. Food always came with a price. Thomas would feed her well before company came, then remind her afterward who provided everything she had. Through the hide walls she could hear voices, men's voices. Her breath quickened as fear clawed up her throat. They would come for her soon, demanding payment for their shelter. Men always demanded payment. The lodge flap moved aside, and Emma's heart stopped. A tall figure stood silhouetted against the morning light, broad shoulders filling the entrance. She pulled her knees to her chest, making herself as small as possible. But the man didn't enter. Instead, he knelt outside the threshold and spoke in careful English. "My grandmother says you have not eaten." Emma couldn't see his face clearly against the bright sky, but his voice carried no anger, no impatience. Still, she pressed herself harder against the wall. "I am Akacheda," he continued, his tone gentle as spring rain. "You are in my grandmother's lodge. She is Winona, our healer." When Emma didn't respond, he moved slowly, telegraph in every motion. A second bowl appeared beside the first, this one containing fresh water. Steam rose from it, promising warmth against her still-cold skin. "The food is yours," Akacheda said simply. "No one will ask anything of you for it." Emma stared at him, waiting for the trap. Thomas used to speak kindly, too, before he drank, before his hands became fists. But this man's voice held something different, a steady patience that didn't demand immediate response. He remained kneeling at the entrance, never crossing the threshold into her space. "You are safe here," he said quietly. "Rest, heal, that is all we ask." Then he was gone, the lodge flap falling closed behind him. Emma sat in the sudden quiet, staring at the bowls he'd left. The meat smelled rich and nourishing, unlike the thin gruel Thomas allowed her when he remembered to let her eat. Her hand shook as she reached for the bowl, half expecting someone to burst in and snatch it away, but the lodge remained peaceful, filled only with the gentle crackle of the fire pit and distant sounds of camp life. The first taste of the stew brought tears to her eyes. When had she last eaten food prepared with care instead of resentment? The meat was tender, the broth warming her from the inside out. She ate slowly, savoring each bite and waiting for someone to tell her she'd had enough. No one came. Through the rest of the day, Winona appeared periodically with fresh water, clean cloths, and healing salves for Emma's cuts. Each time, she moved with quiet respect, tending Emma's wounds without question or judgment. Her weathered hands were gentle as they cleaned and bandaged, so different from Thomas's rough grabbing. Late in the afternoon, Emma heard Akacheda's voice outside again. "There are fresh clothes by the door," he said without entering. "Winona thought you might want them." Emma crept to the entrance and found a soft dress of tanned hide, beautifully decorated with beadwork and far finer than anything she'd ever owned. Beside it lay warm moccasins and a thick fur cloak. She touched the smooth leather with trembling fingers. When was the last time someone had given her something beautiful? Thomas bought her only rough work dresses, claiming anything nice would be wasted on a woman like her. As evening fell, Emma wrapped herself in the new cloak and peered through a gap in the lodge flap. The camp bustled with activity as families prepared evening meals and children played near the fires. And there, across the camp circle, sat Akacheta. He was working on something in his hands, a bow perhaps, or arrows, his dark head bent in concentration. The firelight played across his strong features, highlighting the patience in his expression. Even from a distance, she could see the careful attention he paid to his task. When a child ran close to his fire, Akacheta looked up and smiled. The expression transformed his face, making him seem younger and infinitely kind. He said something to the child that made the boy laugh before sending him back toward his family. Emma found herself watching longer than she intended, studying this man who had found her dying in the snow and asked nothing in return. His movements held none of Thomas's sharp edges, none of the coiled violence that had always lurked beneath her husband's surface. As if he felt her gaze, Akacheta glanced toward her lodge. Their eyes met across the distance, and Emma's first instinct was to hide. But something in his expression, gentle acknowledgment without demand, made her pause. He raised one hand in a small gesture of greeting, then returned to his work, giving her the choice to watch or withdraw without pressure. For the first time in years, Emma didn't feel the need to disappear. When Akacheta found her crying by the river, he didn't demand explanations. Emma had slipped away from Winona's lodge at dawn, needing air and space to think. The water flowed dark and swift before her, carrying away the last of winter's ice. She hadn't meant for anyone to see her tears, but grief had overwhelmed her as she sat on the bank. Not just grief for her suffering, but for all the years she'd lost, all the simple joys Thomas had stolen from her. The sound of her own sobbing had covered his approaching footsteps. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "I didn't mean to leave camp. I just needed... You needed space." Akacheta finished gently, settling on a boulder several feet away. Close enough for conversation, far enough that she didn't feel trapped. There is no shame in tears. Emma studied his profile as he gazed across the water. 3 days in his camp had shown her glimpses of the man beneath the chief's authority. He spoke to his people with respect, listened more than he commanded, and never raised his voice in anger. Even the children seemed to seek his company rather than fear his attention. "How long have you been chief?" she asked, surprised by her own boldness. "Since my 25th winter. My father died in battle with the Blue Coats." His voice carried old sadness, but no bitterness. "I was young to lead, but our elders guided me." "Do you ever regret it? The responsibility?" Akacheta turned to meet her eyes. "A man who seeks power for its own sake should never have it. Those who carry it reluctantly often serve best." He paused, studying her face. "Do you regret leaving your husband?" The question hung between them like morning mist. Emma had expected someone to ask eventually, but not like this, without judgment, as if her answer truly mattered. "No," she said quietly. "I regret staying so long." "What kept you?" The words spilled out before she could stop them. "Fear." He said no one would want a worthless woman like me, that I'd die alone if I left him." She laughed bitterly. "I almost did die alone, in the snow. But you chose to run, despite the fear. I chose to die free, rather than live in chains." Emma picked up a smooth river stone, turning it over in her hands. "He told me I was nothing without him. Maybe he was right." Akacheta was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of absolute certainty. "A man who breaks a woman's spirit to keep her is no man at all. He is a coward who fears her strength." Emma's breath caught. No one had ever called her strong. "I hid for 3 years. I let him hit me, control me, tell me what I was worth. That's not strength. You survived. You protected yourself until the moment came to run. And when that moment came, you took it, knowing you might die." His dark eyes held hers steadily. "That is the deepest kind of courage." Tears threatened again, but these felt different, cleaner somehow. "I don't know how to be anything else. I've been afraid so long I'm not sure who I am without it." "Then you will learn, day by day, choice by choice." He stood slowly, offering his hand to help her rise. "Fear is a river that seems impossible to cross until you step into it." Emma stared at his outstretched hand. Thomas had never helped her up from anything, had usually been the reason she was on the ground in the first place. But Akacheta waited patiently, his palm open and steady, letting her choose. She placed her hand in his. His fingers closed gently around hers, warm and calloused from work and weapons, but infinitely careful. He helped her to her feet without pulling or rushing, then released her immediately. "Thank you," she whispered, "not just for the help, but for everything. The rescue, the shelter, the respect he showed her simply by asking her opinion." "You are welcome here for as long as you wish to stay," he said simply. "That is not charity or pity. Our people believe strength shared makes everyone stronger." As they walked back toward camp, Emma noticed how he matched his pace to hers, never striding ahead or making her hurry. Small kindnesses, but they added up to something she was only beginning to recognize. Safety. Real safety, not the brittle peace that came from walking on eggshells. That evening, as Winona prepared their meal, Emma found herself helping without being asked. Her hands knew the rhythms of cooking, and it felt good to be useful rather than merely tolerated. "You cook well," Winona observed in careful English, her first words to Emma beyond healing instructions. "My mother taught me before she died. It's one of the few skills my husband valued." Winona's weathered hands stilled in their stirring. "What you cannot do, you can learn. What you already know, no one can take from you." After they ate, Emma sat outside the lodge watching the camp prepare for night. Akacheta moved among his people, checking on families, speaking with the evening guards, ensuring all was well. But his gaze found her often, a silent question in his eyes. "Are you all right? Do you need anything?" For the first time since childhood, Emma felt herself beginning to believe that someone cared about her answer. The riders approaching camp wore her husband's cruel smile. Emma spotted them first from where she sat, mending a torn dress, her hands stilling on the needle as 5 men on horseback crested the hill overlooking the Lakota camp. Even at a distance, she recognized the leading figure's slouched posture and the way he scanned the camp like a predator seeking prey. Thomas had found her. Terror turned her blood to ice water. She dropped the sewing and ran toward Winona's lodge, but Akacheta appeared beside her before she could reach the entrance. His hand settled briefly on her shoulder, steadying, not restraining. "Who are they?" he asked quietly, though something in his expression said he already knew. "My husband," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. "He's come for me." The riders had reached the camp's edge now, their horses snorting and stamping as Thomas called out in the arrogant tone Emma knew too well. "I've come for my wife. I know you red dogs are hiding her." Warriors emerged from their lodges, hands moving to weapons, but Akacheta stepped forward with calm authority. Emma started to follow, then froze as Thomas's gaze found her across the camp circle. His face split into that terrible grin she'd learned to fear. "There you are, Emma darlin'. Time to come home." "She is under our protection," Akacheta said, his voice carrying easily across the space between them. He positioned himself directly between Thomas and Emma, a human wall of quiet strength. Thomas laughed, the sound ugly and familiar. "Protection? From my own wife?" He dismounted, his men following suit. "She's property, Indian. My property, bought and paid for with a wedding ring." Emma's hands shook as she watched her worst nightmare unfold. Thomas looked exactly as she remembered. Unshaven face, clothes that reeked of whiskey even at a distance, eyes that held the cold satisfaction of a man who always got what he wanted. "Women are not property here," Akacheta replied steadily. "She stays of her own choice." "Choice?" Thomas spat. "She's a wife, not a whore. She goes where her husband says." His gaze fixed on Emma with poisonous intent. "Get over here, Emma, now." Every instinct screamed at Emma to obey. 3 years of conditioning told her to run to him, apologize, submit to whatever punishment he'd devised for her escape. Her feet actually took a step forward before Akacheta's voice stopped her. "Emma." She looked up to find his dark eyes steady on hers. "What do you choose?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the morning fires. What did she choose? Not what Thomas demanded, not what was expected, but what she wanted. "I choose to stay," she said, her voice thin but clear. Thomas's face darkened. "You don't get to choose. You're my wife." "She was your prisoner," Akacheta corrected with quiet steel. "That ends now." The confrontation escalated quickly. Thomas and his men advanced, hands on gun belts, clearly expecting the threat of violence to settle the matter. But Akacheta's warriors had formed a loose circle around the camp, arrows nocked but not yet drawn. Emma found herself moving without conscious thought, stepping out from behind Akacheta to stand at his side. Her legs trembled, but she lifted her chin and met Thomas's furious gaze directly. "I'm not coming back," she said, amazed by the steadiness in her own voice. "I won't live in fear anymore." Thomas's hand moved to his pistol. "You'll come back or I'll—" Akacheta's arrow appeared in his bow with fluid grace, the point aimed directly at Thomas's chest. Around the camp, every Lakota warrior followed suit. The metallic whisper of steel being drawn filled the air as knives and war clubs appeared in steady hands. "You'll what?" Akacheta asked conversationally, though his eyes had gone arctic cold. For the first time since Emma had known him, Thomas looked uncertain. He glanced around at the circle of warriors, clearly calculating odds he didn't like, but his pride wouldn't let him back down in front of his men. "She's mine by law," he insisted, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "Your law has no power here," Akacheta replied. "Only justice does." The standoff stretched tight as a bowstring, Emma could feel Thomas's rage like heat from a forge. But she also felt something else. The solid presence of Akacheta beside her, the protective circle of warriors who asked nothing of her but had chosen to stand between her and harm. "This isn't over," Thomas snarled finally, recognizing the futility of pressing his demand. "She's still my wife. I'll be back." "Then you'll die," Akacheta said simply, as if commenting on the weather. "And your men with you." The absolute certainty in his voice made Thomas take a step back. His gaze flicked to Emma one last time, promising retribution, before he jerked his head at his companions. "Mount up," he ordered. "This isn't worth dying over a worthless woman." As the riders departed, Emma felt her knees give out, but Akacheta's strong arms caught her before she could fall, holding her steady while the reaction set in. "It's over," he murmured against her hair. "He's gone." But Emma barely heard him. She was staring after the dust cloud raised by Thomas's retreat, finally understanding something that changed everything. She had chosen. When the moment came to run back to familiar misery or stand firm in uncertain freedom, she had chosen courage over fear. She had chosen Akacheta's protection over Thomas's possession. She had chosen love over survival. Emma's hand found Akacheta's as the last of winter's snow began to melt. They stood together at the edge of camp, watching spring paint the prairie in shades of green and gold. Wildflowers dotted the grassland like scattered gems, and the air carried promises of warmth and renewal. 2 weeks had passed since Thomas's departure, and no riders had appeared on the horizon. Emma was beginning to believe what Akacheta had told her that night, that her husband was truly gone, that his threats had been the final snarls of a beaten dog. "I want to stay," she said quietly, her fingers intertwining with his. "Not just for safety, but because this is where I want to build a life." Akacheta turned to study her face, his dark eyes searching for any trace of uncertainty. "Are you sure? Once the choice is made, there can be no going back. You would become part of us completely." Emma had thought of little else since the confrontation. In some ways, she'd been part of the tribe already, helping Winona with healing work, learning their language, sharing meals and stories around the fire. But Akacheta was asking about something deeper. Marriage, true belonging. "I'm sure," she said, amazed by how right the words felt. "I love you." The admission hung between them like morning mist, fragile and beautiful. Emma had never said those words to anyone, certainly not to Thomas, who had claimed her love as his due without ever earning it. "And I love you," Akacheta replied, his voice rough with emotion. "From the moment I found you in the snow, something in my heart recognized something in yours." He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Even that simple touch sent warmth racing through her veins. Everything with him was different. Tender, where Thomas had been brutal. Patient, where her husband had been demanding. "Will your people accept me?" Emma asked, voicing the fear that had haunted her quiet moments. "Winona has already started preparing your wedding dress," Akacheta said with a smile that lit his entire face. "She says any woman brave enough to choose love over fear belongs among us." That evening, as they shared the news with the camp, Emma was overwhelmed by the genuine joy in people's faces. Children who had grown used to her presence clapped their hands and danced around the fire. Warriors offered solemn congratulations. Elder women began discussing feast preparations with the enthusiasm of generals planning campaigns. Winona pressed a cup of tea into Emma's hands, her weathered face creased with pleasure. "You will make him happy," she said in careful English, "and he will make you strong." The wedding preparations took on a life of their own. Emma found herself swept into a world of traditions she was only beginning to understand. Learning the significance of certain beads and feathers, practicing words in Lakota that would bind her life to Akacheta's, listening to stories of other women who had come to the tribe from distant places. "Love makes all people one people," explained Winona as she worked intricate beadwork onto Emma's dress. "Your children will carry both worlds in their hearts." Children. Emma touched her still flat belly with wonder. She'd never dared imagine becoming a mother under Thomas's roof, had actually prayed not to conceive, knowing what kind of father he would be. But the thought of raising Akacheta's children filled her with quiet joy. The night before the ceremony, Emma sat alone under the stars, marveling at the path that had led her here. 6 months ago, she'd been a broken woman convinced she deserved nothing better than brutality and neglect. Now she was about to bind her life to a man who had shown her what real strength looked like. Akacheta found her there, his approach gentle enough not to startle her anymore. Those first weeks, any unexpected sound had made her jump. Now his presence brought only peace. "Having second thoughts?" he asked, settling beside her on the blanket she'd spread on the grass. "Not even one." Emma leaned against his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scents of sage and leather that clung to his skin. "I was thinking about the woman I used to be. Sometimes it feels like she was someone else entirely. She was you learning to survive. Now you're learning to live." His arms came around her, warm and secure. "Both are necessary. Both made you who you are now." Emma tilted her face up to look at him, the man who had saved her from the snow, who had stood between her and violence, who had taught her that love could exist without pain or fear. In the moonlight, his features were carved silver and shadow, beautiful and strong. "Kiss me," she whispered, the first time she'd asked for anything instead of waiting for it to be offered. His lips met hers with infinite tenderness, a promise of all the gentleness their marriage would hold. Emma had been kissed before, had endured Thomas's rough demands, but this was different. This was choice and desire and love freely given. When they finally parted, Emma rested her forehead against his. "Tomorrow, I become your wife." "Tomorrow," he agreed, "but you've been in my heart much longer than that." The ceremony took place at sunset, when the spring sky painted itself in shades of rose and gold. Emma wore the dress Winona had created, soft deer hide decorated with intricate beadwork that told the story of her journey from captivity to freedom. Flowers crowned her hair, white blossoms that Akacheta had picked himself from the prairie. As they spoke their vows in both English and Lakota, Emma felt the last of her old fears finally release their hold. She was no longer the beaten woman who had stumbled through snow toward death. She was Emma, wife to Akacheta, daughter to Winona, member of a people who had welcomed her completely. That night, in their own lodge decorated with gifts from the entire camp, Akacheta loved her with the reverence she'd never known she deserved. Every touch spoke of patience and adoration, building trust alongside passion until Emma finally understood what it meant to be cherished. Later, as she lay in her husband's arms listening to his steady heartbeat, Emma made a silent promise to the woman she used to be. She would never again accept less than love, less than respect, less than the joy that was every woman's birthright. The winter that had nearly killed her was over. Spring had come to stay. Emma wore flowers in her hair for the first time since childhood. Summer had transformed the prairie into an ocean of green, wildflowers nodding and warm breezes that carried the songs of meadowlarks and the distant lowing of buffalo. She sat weaving grass into baskets while Winona prepared their midday meal, her movements careful and deliberate. 3 months of marriage had changed everything and nothing. She was still the woman who had fled into the snow, but now that woman had been given space to heal and grow. The bruises had long since faded from her body, and the deeper wounds to her spirit had begun to close under Akacheta's patient love. "You're different today," Winona observed, glancing up from the stew she was stirring. "Happy different." Emma's hand moved instinctively to her belly, where new life had begun to grow. She'd suspected for weeks, but hadn't been certain until this morning, when the familiar nausea and tenderness had confirmed what her heart already knew. "I have news for Akacheta," she said, unable to keep the smile from her voice. Winona's weathered face creased with delight as understanding dawned. "Ah," she breathed, setting down her stirring stick to clasp Emma's hands in hers. "A child. The spirits smile on your union." Emma nodded, tears of joy threatening to spill over. After years of dreading the possibility of pregnancy with Thomas, the thought of carrying Akacheta's baby filled her with wonder. This child would be wanted, loved, protected. This child would know only gentle hands and patient guidance. "When will you tell him?" Winona asked. "Tonight, when he returns from the hunt." The hunting party had been gone for 3 days, tracking a buffalo herd that would provide meat and hides for the coming winter. Emma had missed Akacheta terribly, but she'd also used the time to work with Winona, learning more of their healing traditions and perfecting her Lakota until she could speak it almost fluently. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, riders appeared on the distant prairie. Emma's heart lifted as she recognized Akacheta's powerful form leading the group, his horse dancing with the excitement of a successful hunt. Behind him, the other warriors drove several pack animals loaded with meat and buffalo hides. The camp erupted in celebration as the hunters returned. Children ran out to greet their fathers, women embraced husbands who had been away, and the elder men gathered to hear tales of the hunt. But Emma's eyes found only Akacheta as he dismounted and walked toward her. He looked magnificent. Face painted with the symbols of the hunt, his hair adorned with eagle feathers that marked his leadership, muscles carved by years of warrior training. But when his gaze met hers, all the fierce pride of the hunt softened into the gentle love she'd come to treasure. "My wife," he said simply, opening his arms. Emma ran to him without hesitation, breathing in the sense of horse and prairie wind that clung to his skin. His embrace lifted her off her feet, spinning her around while she laughed with pure joy. This was love as it was meant to be. Celebration instead of endurance, pleasure instead of duty. "I missed you," she whispered against his neck. "And I missed you." He set her down carefully, his hands framing her face as he studied her. "You look radiant, even more beautiful than when I left." Emma felt heat rise in her cheeks. After months of marriage, his compliment still had the power to make her blush like a girl. "I have something to tell you." Something in her tone made his expression sharpen with attention. "What is it?" She took his hand and placed it gently on her still flat belly. "We're going to have a baby." For a moment, Akacheta went perfectly still. Then his face transformed with a joy so pure it took Emma's breath away. He lifted her again, this time carefully, as if she were made of precious glass. "A child," he breathed, wonder filling his voice. "Our child." "Are you happy?" Emma asked, though his expression made the question unnecessary. "Happy?" He set her down and dropped to one knee, placing both hands on her belly and speaking directly to the life growing there. "Little one, you are already more loved than you can imagine. You will have a mother whose courage shines like the sun, and a father who will teach you the ways of our people." Emma's tears fell freely now, but they were tears of joy. She thought of all the nights she'd lain awake in Thomas's house, terrified of bearing a child into that world of violence and neglect. Now she carried new life in love and hope, surrounded by a community that would cherish this baby as their own. That evening, as the camp celebrated the successful hunt with feasting and storytelling, Winona officially announced Emma's pregnancy. The news was greeted with ululating cries from the women and solemn blessings from the elders. Children, who would soon have a new playmate, danced around the fire with excitement. Later, in the privacy of their lodge, Akacheta worshipped Emma's body with reverent hands, his touches even more tender now that she carried their child. Every kiss spoke of his love for both mother and baby, every caress a promise of protection and devotion. "I never dared dream of this," Emma whispered as they lay entwined afterward. "A loving husband, a child wanted and welcomed, a people who call me daughter." "The spirits knew you belonged here," Akacheta murmured against her hair. "They guided your steps through the snow to find us." Emma thought of that terrible night that now seemed like a lifetime ago. The woman who had stumbled bleeding through the darkness would barely recognize the person she'd become. Confident, cherished, essential to a man who valued her for her strength rather than trying to break it. Outside their lodge, the night sounds of camp settled into peaceful rhythm. Horses shuffled in their rope corrals, night guards called soft greetings to each other, and somewhere a baby cried briefly before being soothed. Soon their own child would add its voice to these sounds, another thread in the tapestry of tribal life. "What should we name the baby?" Emma asked. Akacheta was quiet for a long moment, his hand resting protectively over their growing child. "If it's a daughter, I would like to call her Wope, peace, because that's what you brought to my life." Emma smiled in the darkness. "And if it's a son, Wachenhinska, white hope, to honor the snow that brought you to me." Perfect names for a child born from love instead of obligation, wanted instead of feared, destined for joy instead of sorrow. Emma placed her hand over Akacheta's and felt their baby flutter beneath their joined palms, as if responding to the love already surrounding it. The last of winter's snow had melted months ago, but spring had become summer, and summer would soon give way to autumn and new snow. But Emma no longer feared the changing seasons. She had found her home, her love, her purpose. She had found her way to the place where she belonged.